don't see many other questions, but as we'll see, it's really one nakuda we have to clarify today, and that is the status of a ladle in halacha. Now let me explain. In Hilchos Shabbos, there'll be a difference if a ladle is used, Hilchos kashering, Hilchos Kashrus. But the basic you said we have to know is what the Mishnah says in Shabbos Daf Mem Beis, that basically, and I brought in a pot, so we have a visual aid. This is a kli rishon al gabi ha'esh. This is a pot. Now this pot cooks the soup. The Mishnah says, even when you take this pot off the fire and now it's on the counter, but l'maisa kli rishon is fully capable of cooking. Why? Because the fire heated the pot and heated the food, and as long as the soup or whatever it is still hot, so a kli rishon is capable of cooking even shaloi al gabi ha'esh, even if it's off the fire and koshkin on the fire. But the same Mishnah says, but let's say you put it into this will be the serving bowl. This is a kli sheini. If you put it from the pot into the serving bowl, now this is a kli sheini. Zok the Mishnah across the board kamat, kli sheini cannot cook. Why? That's the Metzias. We'll soon see Taisus. But just to give you a mashal for now, what that means, let's say you had unexpected guests, and there's not enough soup. But you know, as the Baba always taught us, there's always enough. If room in the heart, there's room at home. No problem. To add a little bit hot water, a little bit cold water, to add cold water to this pot of soup is also bishul deraisa, even off the fire. So simple eitzah. Pour from the hot pot into a kli sheini, into a serving bowl, and you're allowed to put in even cold water into the serving bowl. How you talking? You could put cold water into boiling hot soup. This is kli sheini, and kli sheini is not mavashal. Just like a halacha l'maisa, if you pour from a hot soup from a pot into a serving bowl, you could even add ice cubes into this serving bowl, because kli sheini ain't a mavashal. Now you note I chose a mashal of water because we'll soon see that many or most foods we are a suspect of being being kalei bishul that does get cooked in a kli sheini, but water is definitely not kalei bishul. So if you want to expand your soup, don't add cold water to the pot itself, even shalei gabi eish, put it into a serving bowl, and you could add gezun tehet. That is basically a Mishnah in Shabbos Daf Mem Beis, kli rishon versus kli sheini. The big kasha is, what's the difference, kli rishon and kli sheini? This is a pot, and this is a serving bowl. Fine, that's a difference. But how did that affect Hilchos Shabbos? If the soup is hot in the kli rishon, it's hot in the kli sheini. So Taisus, a little earlier, Daf Mem Amud Beis, one of the Yisaitis of today, and Taisus explains, kli rishon has two major qualities that make it a kli rishon. So don't forget, this pot was on the fire. Not only does the food get hot, but the pot gets hot. And that maintains the heat. Therefore, this could cook even shalei al gabi eish. But this is a kli sheini. This is a serving bowl. I took it from the cabinet. The thing itself was cold. So when the hot soup goes into these cold walls, it cools it off. Ava kli sheini, even though it could be atzaletis boy, ein doifena is chamin, since the walls were cold, hoylech umiskarer, and the soup in this kli sheini, this cold kli sheini, cools off. And the assumption is, if the temperature is dropping, it doesn't have the ability to cook. So this is basically kli rishon is bishul deraisa, even shalei gabi eish, and kli sheini is muta, except for kali bishul. Now I'm going to ask you $1 million question, but it's very intriguing. I'm warning you. If I use a ladle to take soup out of a kli rishon, and let's say I fill up this ladle with soup and I freeze, what is the status of the soup in the ladle? In Yiddish, I think the best expression would be nishtahin, nishteher. It's not in the kli rishon any longer, but it didn't get into the kli sheini yet, right? Oh, but you'll say, wait a second, but there's a very big milah here. Or a milah, I'm not sure what the word is. Wait a second. Because you put the ladle into the kli rishon, so heat of a kli rishon. and it wasn't kli rishon. So just like soup in a kli rishon becomes kli rishon, maybe a ladle in a kli rishon becomes a kli rishon. So that's the question. Maybe the ladle is a extension of a kli rishon. You'll say, but wait a minute, the soup pot is shleil gabi ha'esh. How does it make a ladle kli rishon? But then again, you're not allowed to put cold water into this pot because it cooks even shleil gabi ha'esh. So maybe just like a kli rishon that's hot could cook, maybe it makes a ladle into a kli rishon. So kli sheini is understandable. It's out of the kli rishon. But a ladle, maybe if it was immersed in a kli rishon, it became a kli rishon. Or maybe we'll say, wait a minute, old walls. It somehow didn't become a kli rishon, it's a kli sheini. So this is our shayla. And you know what makes it more challenging? Because typically you say, let's be machmer. We're not sure, let's be machmer. But it doesn't work in our shir. I'll tell you why. In Hilchos Shabbos, if I treat this like a kli rishon, is that a chumrah or kula? Chumrah. It's a chumrah. Okay. Now let's say I want to kasher something, and the pot is too heavy. So I want to use a ladle, take out water, and pour the hot water onto the surface that has to be kashered. It's called this a kli rishon. Is that a chumrah or kula? A big kula. So it's not even shach to be machmer or mekel. Hilchos Shabbos, kli rishon is a chumrah. Hilchos kashering, kli rishon is a big kula. So this is our shayla. Now, to my limited knowledge, there's no Gemara that speaks about a ladle. I'm not sure why. It's not like a new invention like cell phones. I don't know, but maybe they didn't use ladles. But a very prominent source, one of the daily rishonim in Mariel and Hagim, it's page Yud in the Mariel and Hagim, he mamish has our shayla. And let me make this very clear. Most things to kasha, you either have to use a boiling, throw in a fork into the tray of fork into the boiling pot of water, or sometimes even more, so you have to use fire. You have to use eish. But there are some cases that you're allowed to kasha with iri kli rishon. L'mashal, a surface that got treif because of irui, so you have to kasher it by irui. That's the general halacha. So you boil up water, and you take the kli rishon, and you pour it on the affected surface. But let's say the pot's too heavy. You can't pick up a pot like that, as big as this. So you want to take a ladle, or any pot for that matter, take the water out, and pour it onto the surface. So that was the shayla. If the ladle is a kli rishon, because it was in a kli rishon, you could kasher it. But if the ladle is a kli sheini, you can't kasher the kli sheini. So the Mariel was asked this very exact question, and he says, kli shoyev, sheshayev yimai, hu kli sheini, on his battle bishul ha-roischim, and you cannot kasher with a ladle. Really, you should kasher with using a kli rishon, submerging it. But you're allowed to use irui, but using a ladle would be considered kli sheini, and you can't kasher it. As I state in Mariel, very, very clear, a ladle becomes a kli sheini. Okay. Now let me ask you a question. According to the Mariel, does that mean that in Hilchos Shabbos we could be mekel and say that a ladle is a kli sheini? So, if the Mariel was convinced that a ladle is a kli sheini, so why can't you be in that case be mekel on Hilchos Shabbos? If you decided it's kli sheini, it's kli sheini. But raise a pella. In the Mariel at the very end, the same volume, it's Amatov Reish Lamed Zayin. Mariel said the following: that he assumed that a kli shoyev, which is the lashon word for ladle, is kli rishon l'chol davar. It's only regarding agala. He was machma, and he said that a ladle is a kli sheini. So this is a totally different picture. The Mariel was not sure the status of a ladle, and therefore he was machma on both ends. Hilchos Shabbos treated like a kli rishon, so it's no big heta. Hilchos kashering treated like a kli sheini, and you can't kasher with it. So it's a pliya. The grace of Mariel couldn't be machriya. But wait, there's one more very important part of our sugya. And that's the Taz and Yeridei at the end of Siman Tzadik Beis. The Taz quotes our Mariel, that I just mentioned, that you can't kasher with a ladle. And he says, Tamati ma'oid hazeh. I don't understand this. Because Lamaisa, a ladle is definitely a kli rishon. And it's so much a kli rishon, l'chayr of the taz, you could even kasher with it. Why? And he says, l'chayr, pretty good arguments. He says, if you want to kasher a fork, that became treif. So you just put it into a kli rishon. How does it kasher it? I thought it becomes a kli sheini. Oh, it is a kli sheini. Also, if you stick a fleishig, a fork, into a hot pot of milchigs, it becomes treif. Why don't we say that the spoon is like a kli sheini? The teretz is when it goes into a kli rishon, it becomes a kli rishon. And then he quotes a Gemara. It's Mavel Harayin. If you learn superficially, you see something one way. If you learn it properly, it's a whole different picture. In Shabbos, Daf Mem Amud Beis, Mar tells a story that Rabbeinu HaKadosh went to a merchatz, and is talking about Chamei Tveri, there's no Issa merchatzois, and his devoted Talmud Rabbi Yitzchak says he wanted to give him oil to anoint himself with, which is Mutar on Shabbos, but the oil was cold, and it wasn't good for the Rebbe, it's too cold. So he wanted to heat the oil, and put it into the merchatz. So Rebbe goes, no, that's bishul. Tol b'kli sheini v'tein. Put water in the kli sheini, and then you can put the oil in, because kli sheini ain't a mavashal. Now, how do you touch those words? Tol b'kli sheini v'tein. So the Taz says people would think it means, let's say, take a ladle, if it's big enough, take water out, and put the oil in it. Now, what does that mean? That means on Shabbos that's mutter. Why is it mutter on Shabbos? Because a ladle is a kli sheini. So it's not true. Ladle's a kli rishon. So it can't be pshat. Put it into the ladle and put the oil in. Because why the lukshen tol b'kli sheini? Tol in the actual ladle. And also, why is all of a sudden this becomes a kli sheini? This is a ladle. Says the Taz, adarabah. It means take a ladle out some water, put that water into a kli sheini, and then put your oil in. In other words, a ladle is a kli rishon. So from the Gemara is apparent, you're making two steps. Get the water in a ladle, and what's the water at that point? Rishon. Put it, tol b'kli sheini, tak a kli sheini, a different keli, ladle, and then put the oil in. And therefore he says, no doubt about it, that a ladle is a kli rishon. And listen then what he adds, and it's beautiful. He says, Tosfos says, what's the maila of a kli sheini? Doifenais miskaros. This ladle in the pot is not doifenais miskaros. It's getting kachadik, it's getting more warmed by the pot. So therefore he says, no doubt about it, a ladle is a kli rishon. And yet, after all this, he says, but I must tell you, in hilchos kashering, you have to be machmir and assume that a ladle is a kli sheini. So in hilchos Shabbos, you're machmir, it's a kli rishon, and in hilchos kashering, you're machmir, it's a kli sheini. So the Taz, if this whole arichas ends up just like the Maril, that we cannot really determine the status of a ladle, we're machmir on Shabbos, and we're machmir on hilchos kashrus.
There should be a difference if you put the ladle.
Yeah, we're going to get that. Good, we're going to get to that soon. Now, I must mention also, if you look in the Taz and hilchos Shabbos, Shin Yud Ches Yud Tes, he says so beferish, that we treat a ladle l'chumra like a kli rishon on Shabbos. Now, it's not a stira, but what's very interesting is people can't figure out what a ladle is, but I think the pshad is, the difficulty is, because it's very unusual. Because typically, kli rishon is in one keli, kli sheini is from a cold keli. This is a cold keli going into a kli rishon, and especially if the fire is underneath, it's being boiled. So why should it not be a kli rishon? But then again, it has its own identity. But you know what's even more b'gishmak? The Chavaz Das, that's the Grois in the Sivis, in Yeridei Tzadik Beis, Chav Zayin in the Biurim, he takes strong exception to the Taz, and he says a ladle is a kli sheini. But you know what he's coming from? Because he says, if you look at Tosfos, Tosfos says there's two milas of a kli rishon. Number one, there's a fire underneath, and number two, the walls are hot. So he says, I feel that the ikka mile of a kli rishon is the fire underneath. Now, if that's the case, by a ladle, maybe there's no fire, maybe it's a kli rishon l'gabi eish. There's no fire underneath, it's a kli sheini. But the Taz held, what's the main mile of a kli rishon? Doifnais miskaros. And this is not doifnais miskaros. So the machlokes, kli rishon, kli sheini, is really based on Tosfos. What makes something kli rishon? Is it the fact there's a fire? Or is it enough that it is doifnais, hot? And a ladle, the walls are hot, and that's basically the sheet of Chavos Das. But the shach and the kudas hakesef, pri chodesh, el yirah, begro, all the poskim go with the taz. So let's be very clear. Although my some do question the taz, but I saw a very interesting the Chavos Yor and the Tshuva in Kufhei. He says, although we could argue on the taz, but mi yachalek misvaras keres al taz. Who's going to argue with a boich svara on the taz? In other words, don't play around with the taz. So Rabbi say, now we basically have Baruch Hashem, the status of a ladle. Let me ask you the question. So what is a ladle lamaisa? Kli rishon, kli sheini, or both? Or none of the above? The answer is it's none of the above. Not a kli rishon only, not kli only, not both. It's l'chumra on both ends. Shabbos v'machmer and kashrus v'machmer. Now you can understand what really the Maril himself says. The Maril himself that says you can't kasher with a ladle, he says, but if you have to kasher with a ladle because you can't lift the pot, I have a great eitzah. Take the ladle, put it into the pot, and keep it there. Be masha it there. What's the assumption? Then everything becomes hot. So you transform the ladle into a kli rishon. The Maril says it, and Mishnah Berurah in Hilchas Pesach, Hagala Tafnun Beis, Yitkat and Chaf, quotes this as well. Halacha. Okay, the Chavos Das has his problem, but Mishnah Berurah, Magen Avram all say that. But there's one more factor, and then we're going to apply this more specifically. And that is the Chazon Ish in Kuf Chav Beis, Yitkat and Gimel. He says, I have another point. Let's say you're kashering with a hot pot, a ladle, but the fire is on underneath the hot pot of water. So you're ladling out the water, and with the fire that's still warming the water. So the Chazon Ish, if there's an eish underneath, all agree, even regarding kashering, that it's a kli rishon. And the svar is mosek midvash. Because the only chesaron is, of kli sheini, there's no eish, and there's no doifnais miskaros. There's no doifnais chamen. Here, you have an eish, and doifnais mischamen. And the Chazon Ish was mechaven really to an earlier source, and that's the Chamuri Daniel in Dinei Kli Rishon Ois Aleph, that if the Kli Rishon is agabi or eish that's on, you could even ladle the water and kasher. Because basically, when you keep the ladle in the pot, it becomes a Kli Rishon. So you're basically moving a Kli Rishon. You're pouring it out, but then again, when you pour the pot, it's also iroi. Iri Kli Rishon is able to kasha certain things. Now, the Chazon Ish himself in Yeridei Simul Amabez is a shtickle asois himself, but I think we could say the following. If you want to be very safe, take the ladle, put it into the boiling pot, agabi or eish, keep it there. Now, once you keep it there and you have the fire on, I think you're certain that it is a real Kli Rishon. Okay, so let's apply this to mice. Let's start with a simple shayla. The wife made the soup, everything is fine, but the pachar is she forgot to add spices, and you can't serve soup that's not spiced. Now tell people to add spices, it's not going to go. So the question is, how and when is it mutter to add spices to a hot pot of soup? So one thing is a Mishnah. To add spices to the hot pot that's Kli Rishon is awesome. Even shloil gabi eish, because Kli Rishon is mavashel, and don't forget, ground pepper was never cooked. It was ground but not cooked. So you can't add pepper to the pot. Question: if you ladle a little bit of the soup and put it into a bowl, can I add spices to this? Yeah. So here, this is mamash shayla l'chayra. The question is, if a ladle is a kli rishon, then this is kli sheini, and kli sheini could be bishul if it's kaliyah bishul. And indeed, the Mishnah Berurah says this Shin Yud Ches Pei Zayin, when he's talking about water issue, we'll soon see about adding water, he says that even if you use a ladle like a Kli Rishon. In other words, he says, he's going with the shittis that on Shabbos or Machma, ladle's a Kli Rishon. And he says, certainly, if you masha it, you keep it in the bowl, it's a Kli Rishon. Oh. So the Mishnah Berurah is very consistent. Like the Taz and Maril, we treat it on Shabbos like a Kli Rishon. So the ladle is the Kli Rishon, and the soup bowl is a Kli Sheini. Now, could be spices. Mutter will soon get to that. But before we, are too quick to paskin like this, The Mishnah Berurah, a little earlier, actually 42 sif cottons earlier, same shin yud ches sif cotton mem hey, he discussed that you want to add matzoh, challah, croutons, baked items to your hot bowl of soup. So Mishnah Berurah says, basically, if you ladle out the soup and put it into your bowl, you could add baked items into your soup. Now, the question is, but if the soup is still hot, why don't we say it's bishul? The matzah, the croutons were baked, but that we know, yesh bishul achafiyah. And in fact, it could be, and that's the way the Yereim assumes, that these baked items are kali bishul. So it's not even mutter to sheini. So how can you add baked items to your bowl of soup? What is it at most? Kli sheini. Came from the pot, ladles kli rishon, and you put it into the bowl. So Mishnah Berurah says, well, that's why the best eitzah is wait till the soup cools off, and then you could add the croutons. But people like a hot soup, so it's not practical. So the Mishnah Berurah, or at least use a ladle, so then your bowl of soup is a kli shlishi. Now this is a stira. Sif cotton pays ayin, he says ladle is a kli rishon and the bowl is a kli sheini. And Sif cotton mem hey, he says a ladle is a kli sheini and the bowl is a kli shlishi. Now one thing I guarantee you, the Mishnah Berurah was not sois himself. He had much too much yigia and much too much siyata d'shmaya to be sois himself. Rabbi Yakov told me that Chavz Chaim was zoicha to write like a rishon. You can make like his words from a rishon like a rishon. But to say he was sois himself in the same siman, unthinkable. And the Emes Mishnah Berurah in the third place, Reish and Gimel Pei Daled, also says if you have a kaf, a ladle, you could be makel. So here's the shank out of the sugya, everything fits in beautifully. Did you ever wonder, we're talking about ladling out soup from a hot pot of soup on the fire. Wait a second. We don't make kagos al gabi eish. You're not allowed to stir, mix, or scoop out food from a pot al gabi eish. What's Mishnah Berurah talking about? The teretz is, and you see it's so unbelievably meduyik, the Mishnah Berurah taka, when he's talking about in Shin Yud Ches, Sif Cotton Peizai, and he's talking about water. Water, there's no hagasa, because it's all one volume of water. So the Mishnah Berurah there is talking about that the pot of water is on the fire, and you make it agabi eish. Oh, agabi eish, all agree is a kli rishon. So it gets to your bowl of soup, at most a kli sheini, and that's why it's chumrah. But the other place, you look, he's talking about a hot food. You can't be making agabi eish. It has to be being made, you took the pot off the fire, you make it agabi eish. Then, agabi eish, we could assume rightfully so, that's already a kli sheini. That's what the Moran Shabbos, Amud Reish Mem Dalet says. Now it's a little of a chiddush because Mishnah Berurah doesn't make this big chiddush, he doesn't say anything, just as if we're supposed to figure it out. But a much more pashut and a much more fundamental chiluk is the following. When you have halacha eyes, you look at a ladle, you know what a ladle is? Synonymous with ladle? Suffix. Right? I'm not sure what a ladle is. I mean, you see in Hilchos Shabbos Azoy, in Hilchos Kashering Azoy, it's one big suffix. So one suffix you have to be machmer. But let's say you have a situation, you have two sveikas, or two tztadim to be makel. Maybe the two tztadim add up to a legitimate heta. And that's the Mishnah Berurah's real pshat, you should know. Because when you use a ladle and you put it into this bowl of soup, it's not certain it's a kli sheini. Maybe the ladle's a kli sheini and there's a kli shlishi, but you have to be machmer. Now you want to put in baked items. Baked items is also a suffix. You look at Shin Yud Ches Sif Hey, some say ain't bishul achafiyah. It's a chumrah. So azoy vayit darf man nicht machmer sein. So when you have two coolers, that's when the Mishnah Berurah says you could rely on the ladle being a sheini, bowl shlishi, because that's two coolers that coincide, you could be makel. And you'll look at it, you'll see that's very meduyik, the Minchas Yitzchak, Chelekei, Kuv, Chavzai, and Gimel. And I found a half a dozen of the Heintige Poiskim that all say the same Yisoid. So let's review the Yisoids, and we're going to apply this to Maisa. Basically, Kli Rishon is able to cook even Shlei Gabi Eish. Kli Sheini doesn't cook anything except for Kali Bishul, which is a lot, as we'll soon see. A ladle is a suffix. We treat it l'chumra and Shabbos and kashering. we could reasonably say if you have a pot al gabi eish with the fire on, the ladle is a kli rishon. But also, and most important, if you have a ladle with another kula, another tzad heta, that adds up to a heta. Now you'll see how practical this is. A person is making hot coffee on Shabbos. So the oldest question is, why can't I just do things simply? And this is a hot cup, right? Why can't I put the coffee powder into my cup, like I do during the week, and run the water into it? What's wrong? Why do I have to have 2 cups, 3 cups? It just gets confusing. So the truth is, it's not a bad question. Because all of instant coffee, and instant tea for that matter, was once cooked. They take the coffee beans, actually they grind it into coffee ground, they cook it, it's a very extremely thick, soupy coffee liquid. Then they remove the water through freeze drying, they used to use spray dry, but basically then you have powdered coffee or powdered tea. That is 100% nizbashal. I mean, it's as cooked as you can be. So, why can't I just put the coffee into my cup, run the water onto it, I don't have to have cups all over the place? So it's a good kasha. The only reason that we use a second cup is because the coffee powder is now a powder. But in its use as a coffee powder, it's soluble and it liquefies and it becomes a liquid. Now, napshat, you can't find it in the liquid. Like you throw sand in a liquid, it's still there, but that's there. This becomes a liquid. So the Shara Tshuva wants to say that maybe we have to treat a powder liquid as a liquid. Once the powder is a liquid, yes, bishalach by davalach. So that's why we use an extra cup. So then we'll hold it by kli shlishi. Fine. Now, this is interesting that some people really like a hot coffee. They don't like this business of taking a cup to another cup. So he's an aggressive fellow. And when no one's looking, I guess, he goes over to the urn in the shul, picks up the cover, takes his cup clean, and sheps out water, and now he wants to use it and put his coffee into it. So he says, well, now it's a sheini. But he's wrong. Because this is a bona fide kli rishon chaladeis, because he's a lamda, but he didn't think what he was doing. He's drawing water from agabi eish, and this is a ladle. It's not a ladle, so it's a spoon. It's a cup, but this is water from agabi eish, and this would still be the original kli rishon. Someone rinsed a bowl. Okay, this is the soup bowl for today, and he wants to add soup into this bowl, and he's too lazy to dry it off, or he enjoyed a good bowl of soup. Now there's a little bit cool soup in the bowl, and he wants to have doubles. The question is, can he add hot soup to this bowl that either has water or cool soup? So we'll go one step at a time. If this has water that rinsed the bowl, it was never cooked, that technically is bishul. If that water gets cooked, so it's bishul deraisa. The only question is, if I use a ladle and I pour it on like this, would that be a tzad heta? Maybe I'll say a ladle is a kli sheini. Once a ladle is a kli sheini, so going into the bowl is a iri kli sheini. Water is the one of the things that's not kali bishul and never cooks in a kli sheini. Certainly it doesn't cook in an iri kli sheini. So I can take a ladle, pour hot soup into the bowl as is. But here we're going to say, you have to rewind a second. Because this ladle, we have to treat l'chumra like a kli rishon. Right? Because on Shabbos we treat it like kli rishon. This is iri kli rishon going into cold water. And that's mevashel, at least kedei klifa, zokti chazinish, and the aleph, the end of tzad gimel. Even though it's just a little bit water, let's say it's bottle, you can't be bottle and bishul. It might be chatzi shir, and chatzi shir is also midaraisa. So basically, to add hot soup from a ladle onto cold water, again, you rinse with cold water typically, that is definitely a problem in Hilchos Shabbos. Now, next question, let's say you use this ladle and you serve. Now the ladle is cooled and the soup in it, a little bit of soup is cooled. Can I reuse the ladle as is and put it back into the pot? So if the soup in the ladle is still hot, so hot is hot. But I'm talking about it really cooled off, it's cold. By a liquid, yesh bishul acha bishul. But you want to say, there's a ladle. But wait a minute, look what you're doing. You're taking this ladle and putting it back into the kli rishon. Shalei agabi eish, albeit. But kli rishon cooks. So this is a major problem. You're putting cool soup into a kli rishon. Kli rishon, the Mishnah says, cooks even shalei agabi eish. Now, the next question is, let's say I take from a ladle, I want to add it to my bowl that has leftover cooled soup. I'm having doubles. I have the leftovers from the singles in the bowl. Can I take from the soup and pour it directly onto my leftovers from my first bowl that's completely cold? So this we have two sveikas lahakol. First, I'm using a ladle. And also, the soup in this bowl is not the end of the world. What is the soup in this bowl? Yesh bishlacha bish by davalach. We all know that in halacha, many rishonim are mekel. Ain't bishlacha bish by davalach. Unlike the first case where it was water from a sink that was never cooked, this is soup that was cooked. So we have two reasons to be mekel. First of all, maybe a ladle is a sheini. And also maybe yesh ain't bishlacha bish by davalach. And that's why it's okay to be soymech on this. Mishmur F, she can be makel, but that's what it seems like you could be makel. A ladle onto it, and you don't have to dry it first because we have two reasons to be makel that both add up. Now, this would be another question also. Let's say you have a cooked soup that cooled off. And I want to take more hot soup with a ladle and pour it into the cool soup just to to revive it a little bit to make it warm. So I'm adding hot soup into cold soup. So again, this is the same heta, l'chayra. You have two svaras you mekel. Ladle, and the worst scenario, this soup is ein bishlacha bishul, even by davalach. And this, the Mishnah himself says in Rishon and Gimel, Sifkat and Pei Dalet. And you'll look at it, you'll see that's the case that I mentioned earlier. Because he's saying if you have two reasons to be mekel, you could add them up. So to take hot soup from the kli rishon and put it into a bowl that has cool soup, we have two starting to be mekel, and you could be mekel. Question. With this very negeya, because I'm in a camp, in camps and hotels, all these big moistus, they have a pot of soup that no one could lift. I mean, they have to add the water, as it is, but they have the pot of soup on a heating element. Actually, it's a fire type of element, but it's basically a hot pot that they don't pick off the fire. So there you have these questions of actually taking food, ashagabi eish. That's much more chomer. Because then we have no suffix that the ladle that goes into this big pot, klirisha, because it's agabi or eish, and it is taka very hot. Now, typically the fire is supposed to go off when they serve the soup, but if the fire is on, don't forget that would be a klirisha agabi or eish, and all of the ladles are klirisha, and pouring from the ladle onto cooled soup is only one side to be makel, and taka that should not be done. The next point, which I wanted to mention, someone asked me an interesting question. Is it a maila, whenever you're serving soup, to always keep the ladle in the pot of soup? I said it's a maila and a chasar, and I'll tell you why. Because if you keep the ladle in the soup at all times, you don't have a problem of soup that cooled off. The ladle's always hot. So then you could take it out, serve again, put it back, serve again. You never have a problem of cooled soup in a ladle, because it's always hot. But the issue is the chumrah, the ladle in the kli rishon the whole time is going to get hot after a while, and then it's not a cooled kli sheini, it's probably a warmed kli rishon. Question. Let's say someone wants to avoid sveikis, so he knows a hot pot of soup, he takes a ladle, and he sticks it in quickly and takes out some soup quickly. Did he avoid this becoming a kli rishon because it was in the pot for the shortest amount of time? So the Maram Kaziz, one of the Gedolei Kadmoinim in Shabbos, Taf Mem Beis Mem Beis, and Rabbi Yashiv was masking to this. If you put it in Rega Kememre that it didn't get hot, then it doesn't become a Kli Rishon. I mean, talk about facts. Now, how do I know? So if you have time on a Friday, don't get in your wife's way, but go into the kitchen, take a ladle. This guy is plastic, a metal will be easier to work with. Take a metal ladle, Stick it into the soup and take it out quickly and feel it. And you tell me, it's not piping hot. It can't get hot so quickly. So Maram Kaziz and Rabbi Yasha agreed to that. It's not a gzeres hakos of ladle is kli rishon. Ladle that's in a pot is a suffix. You keep it a long time, vadai. That's the maril. But in and out, maybe it's a kli sheini. So you have to experiment to make sure that he's doing it right. But it makes sense that once the ladle was in and out so quickly that it didn't absorb the heat, it still retains its kli sheini status. Next question, you want to add baked items to a hot soup. So as I explained, really baked items is fully baked. But we're choishes for the rishonim that yesh bishul achafiyah. You look and see if Mechaber Amor mentioned the 2 days, so it's not certain, but it's enough for Yirei Shemayim, where machmir, we don't add baked items to a kli rishon. Here's where we see the Mishnah Berurah's big yisoid. That you want to add it to a hot bowl of soup, best would be if the soup cooled. Then you have no problem, or beyond yad sledes by. But if you want to have a hot soup with your knedlach, with your croutons, then if you use a ladle, so again, the soup pot is a kli rishon, ladle will rely on the cool as a kli sheini, it gets into your bowl, it's a kli shlishi, you're adding matzoh and croutons, and we're assuming that it is mutter because there's 2 sveikis. The matzah maybe ain't bishul achafiyah, and maybe the ladle is a kli sheini, it makes it a kli shlishi. So even though matzah is kalia bishul, we're going to have to hope that in a kli shlishi, it's not hot enough to cook the kalia bishul. Now, this is important to mention also, because if you have, sometimes there are certain croutons that are actually deep fried, which means not just baked, but it's cooked in a big amount of oil. Deep fried is considered bishul chol davar. There's no difference cooking in water or in oil. So we could assume that deep fried mandlin, when that's the mitzias, you're allowed to put even into a kli sheini, because ein bishul acha bishul, and this is not a davar ofui. So that's the klal that we have to make a point of. Here's the next question. Sometimes people don't realize that. But let's say you want to dip your cake into the hot coffee. Shabbos by Kiddush at home, whatever it is, you have a hot coffee, and you want to dip mezainis into the cake. Into the coffee, I'm sorry. So this is very similar to the above, don't forget. Because if we assume that the cup of coffee is a kli sheini, then we have to still be choishish yesh bishul achafiyah on the cake. So if you poured the water from the urn into this cup, okay, and then you added coffee, which is pretty okay. Now to add cake into that is yesh bishul achafiyah, because a kli sheini at most, nothing else. If you made coffee like most people use 1 cup and use a second one, so there's a kli shlishi, then you could dip in the cake or the cookies into the kli shlishi. But if there's a real kli sheini coffee, we have to be choishes yesh bishul achafiyah, even a kli sheini. Now, a point I want to mention, which some gets me a little nervous, you come to especially yeshiva or big moisid, there's hot cups all over the place, because people make coffee and they have to use kli hazoi. Now, they end up, kol ma'abrez and meshubach. If you use your cup, KUP, all you have to have for 1,000 people is 1 extra cup. Not 1 per person. And I'll show you, it's very poshut. Let's say you're a sheini, you do things like chatchila. So you pull a clean hot cup, okay, and you put water into it, okay? Now, but you're not going to make coffee in that, even though really you could add coffee then, but you put it into another cup, okay? Then you add your coffee, you put this down. The next fellow that comes also takes his clean hot cup. Let him put the coffee in this cup. There's cold water from the previous fellow, but cold water can never get cooked beyond the kli rishon. Kli sheini doesn't get cooked. This is even iri kli sheini. Let him use this for his coffee, and then put down his original cup, and you'll go chayze chalila. 1,000 people only have to have 1 cup. Okay, now some question hot cup, whatever. But my point is 1 cup for 1,000 people if you use your cup, and that's poshut. But the point is because water can never get cooked beyond the kli rishon. Now, we had a question at home or in a big camp situation that it's not just one person wants to have croutons. See, if you're home alone, you take a ladle quickly, you put it in the soup, take it out. If you have a lot of people that want soup with mazoinis, very simple eitzah, and that you can't go wrong. Take the soup pot, put it into a serving bowl, okay? Then you could do what you want. Because this is a sheini, the challah. Then once you use a ladle, from a ladle for sheini is fine. So basically you could put it into a serving bowl and then you don't have to worry what's the status of the ladle, it got cold or hot. This is a clear-cut sheini. Someone remember to make, what?
You said it's challah, no?
Yeah, but then we rely on the ladle here because you have baked foods. Don't forget. Now, good news, he remembered to make lukshen for the soup. The bad news, he forgot to put it on the blech before Shabbos. So he has cold lukshen in the refrigerator. And his wife wants to serve the soup. Where's the lukshen? And he's embarrassed to say he didn't think that he forgot to warm it. So there's a simple eitzah if you have the right facts. If indeed the lukshen is definitely fully cooked, but it's dry, so take the lukshen and put it right into the bowl, into the pot of soup, shlo gabi eish. Why not? Ein bishlach habishal. You can't put it into the pot agabi eish, but shlo gabi eish is no problem. The only problem is typically after you make lukshen, you rinse it, and there's water that was never cooked. So you have to either dry the lukshen quickly from all the water, or find a different eitzah. The eitzah would be put the soup from the pot into your serving bowl, and then manashach is mutter. The lukshen ain't bishlach habishal. The water never gets cooked in a sheini. So one of the two eitzahs you do, and really you can't go wrong. Someone made soup and they forgot to spice it. So here again, it's not the end of the world. To add spices to the rishon, even shlo gabi eish, is bishul, because again, pepper was never cooked. But it's a simple eitzah. Take the pot and put it into a serving bowl. You're going to pour it straight or use a ladle, no difference. So now this bowl is a sheini. This serving bowl is a sheini, right? The Mishnah says you're allowed to add tavlin into a sheini, because tavlin is one of the few things that we know is not a kali abishal. So after you have the soup in your serving bowl, which is very reasonable, add the spices, and then you can put it on the table, and there's no busha that you forgot to add spices. Perfect. The only issue I must mention, Rabbi Zalman in the Shmir Shabbos L'chasa, Hey Kufnun Beis, says an incredible chiddush. He says spices, the way they grew, are not kali abishal. Pepper does not grow as ground. Pepper grows as a peppercorn, this big, and the peppercorn is not kali abishal. But they sell finely ground pepper, that's kali abishal. Look at it, it's so small. Now, the chiddush gadol of this psak is that he's assuming in times of Chazal, they use peppercorn. But all the chayim, all the heintige paiskim wonder, they also ground it. They didn't have cell phones, but they definitely had grind tchina. You learn Masech the beya, toichin, and yamtiv, dak. So I just must mention, Rabbi Zalman has a reservation about pepper, but most paiskim hold in a sheini it's okay. Adding salt to this sheini is also mutter. Now salt is a sugya for itself, because Mishnah discusses some salt was mined, never cooked. Typically, salt today in America, al kapanim, was cooked, but lamaisa to add a sheini is okay. Recently, they started making salt, it's not cooked. It's a much lower temperature. It's basically, the water is dried from it. So that's more of an issue, but there's definitely what to make and putting in a shlishi certainly, and perhaps even a sheini for a different reason that we're not going to get into now. If you had unexpected guests and you need to expand the soup, no problem. Put the soup into a serving bowl, add as much as cold water as you like, and that would be, again, without a suffix. Question, interesting question. A person has a sheini. Okay, let's go about the serving bowl. And you ladle out soup, and this is very hot. You ladle out soup from a sheini. Very posh, we do it all the time, right? You have a serving bowl, you ladle out soup. What's the status of the soup in the ladle? So pashit zil basatayma. It's like sheini, right? We're assuming that a ladle is just like the sheini. Kli rishon, no difference kli sheini. And that's what the poskim assume. Because you don't say, well, since it's a kli sheini, so the ladle becomes a kli shlishi. Mechatesa. We assume in halacha, in Shabbos, the ladle takes on the identity of the keli. So a ladle from a kli rishon is a kli rishon. A ladle from a kli sheini becomes a kli sheini as well. And that's really what all the points that I found say this beferish. Nothing changes because it has the original identity of where it came from. Kli rishon or kli sheini. The Shvis Shabbos and Chaf Aleph, the Shmir Shabbos and Aleph Kuf Nun Ches, both say this beferish. Question: someone did not have a ladle, so he decided to use a hot cup as a ladle. In other words, he immersed the hot cup into the kli rishon, the soup pot, took it out, and now put it into a soup bowl. What is the halacha regarding a hot cup? Is a hot cup like a regular keli, and therefore it's a kli rishon? Or maybe a hot cup would be different. Now here's the chachma, the patent of a hot cup. The hot cup, made of styrofoam, you could always hold on to it. Masha enkein, a glass, it gets very hot. A metal gets very hot. What's pshat? So this is the chachma, the science of a styrofoam is that it doesn't absorb heat. It maintains the heat pretty well, but doesn't absorb the heat. So here the shaila is, if you use not a metal or even a plastic lid, a plastic also absorbs somewhat. This is a styrofoam. Do we say that this would become a vadai kli sheini? And here it works l'kula. So that's pretty mistavra. Histaka saw the Sefer Shabbos Kalach Amid Pei Hey. Histaka says very good. That first of all, there's no eish under this. And also, it's not doifnois, mechamamois. It's not mekarois, but it's not mekar, but it's not mechamamois. So it's basically a neutral position. And he wants to assume that this styrofoam, being that it does not agabe eish, that's certain. And more so, the fact is that it's not doifnois mischamamois, it's not mekaris in between. You could treat this like a kli sheini. Someone asked me, he took a piece of kugel with a spatula. Is there any tzad to say that a spatula makes it like a kli sheini, like a ladle, and therefore he put it into his plate, it's a kli shlishi? So he made a big mistake, because it's not a din you transfer something, it's a din that the soup was in a ladle that had a wall to it that was mekaros. A spatula is like a fork that's just transferring but doesn't affect the kugel itself. But more of a mistake that he made is that he forgot that a kugel, like other dava gush, is not affected by kli rishon kli sheini. If you take a piece of chicken from the pan and put it into a bowl, so like many rishonim, dava gush is still like a kli rishon. So a spatula certain doesn't affect that. A fork, a spatula is just transferring. A ladle, which is a keli, in a keli is an issue. So that's why the chicken or the kugel that was removed by a spatula onto a plate is dava gush. Can I add, this is an American shayla, of course, can I add ketchup to my piece of chicken on my plate, or hot potato from the challah, or hot meat from the challah? So this is beautiful, because Mamash I will sugi from a different angle. Because pashtis, if you say dava gush is like kli rishon, so the piece of meat or potato on my plate is a kli rishon. How could I add ketchup? But Ramosha says, the chelik dalet ayin dalet if cotton hay, here we have the same two coolers coinciding. But listen to his Einfall. Because no one is certain that dava gush is still a kli rishon. Machoyks rishonim? We're machmer. And azoy dav zayin. But and what's the problem with ketchup? Ketchup was vade cooked. Teretz is it cooled. So yesh bishlach abish by davalach. So you have two chumras coinciding. You don't have to machma zoyvait. Number one, dava gush is a chumrah, and ketchup davalach ein bishlach is also a chumrah. The two chumras coincide. You can be mekel. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's two chumras. Either way, each one will machma. Rabbi Yashiv, this is vintage Rabbi Yashiv. He has a different angle, and he says, why is yesh bishlach abish by davalach? Very logical, because you give someone a hot tea. Oh, that's kishmak. Cold tea is not a hot tea. It's not. It's different mitzias. But ketchup is made to use as cool, so it never lost its bishul status. So lemaisa, you could have your ketchup and eat it on Shabbos as well. So that's definitely pashit that we got, because again, it's the two cool chumras that coincide. Now moving on to a little bit of hilchas kashering. So basically, again, if someone wants to kasher a surface and he's allowed to use iri kli rishon, again, typically that's not the case. Typically you have to either use eish or hagolah, but he's allowed to use iri. And he can't lift up the pot. What you should do is pick up the pot and pour it onto the surface, but it's too heavy. Can he, lamaisa, use a ladle out the water and pour it onto the surface? So that's the agreement of Maril and Taz, Magen Avram, everybody. You can't do that. Because l'chumra, we have to say that a ladle is a kli sheini and it's incapable of kashering. And that's what the Paiskim say. The only thing I could mention is what the Magen Avram says, Tafnan Beis Tes, which is really echoing what the Maril said, that if you want, you could keep the ladle in the pot until it gets good and hot, and rely on shehiyah, maintaining the kli rishon status, and then kasher with that. The emphasis of kashering we never do on Shabbos. During the week we do, right? So why not do a little better and keep the pot on the fire and keep the fire on, so you have both milas, shehiyah and agabi yoesh, and then you zicha safe l'chol hadayis. Question: someone used a ladle and took out hot soup, so far so good, but put it into a milchig bowl. What's the status of the bowl? The bowl was used this morning for hot farina. Now we put in hot milchig farina, that is. Now we put in fleishig soup. So here we have to be honest and realize that this ladle, l'chumra, is a kli rishon. So iri kli rishon is mavashel kadei klipa. So the bowl is affected, and part of the soup is also affected. Because in this case, it's a regular ladle kli rishon. Iri kli rishon is mavashel kadei klipa, and definitely affects that part of the bowl that it hits. But more pashit. People think ladle all of a sudden has a cooler. If a person used a milchig ladle and immersed it into a hot pot of chicken soup, that's not a problem. The fact that it's a ladle is not exeris hakosher that it's a cooler. You're putting a milchig keli into a fleishig pot. That's a real bas v'chalav issue. So the ladle needs kashering, that's certain. And if there's no shishim of the ladle in the soup, then the soup is a problem. Because the fact that it's a ladle is only an issue when you ladle out food, but when you put it in, and especially when the fire is on, that makes a real taruvas abasa b'chalav. Last question, ma'isa shahaya, but it just shows that how when you learn a sugya, everything fits in, Bez Hashem, if you get to the bottom of it. Someone had a pot of soup al gabi yoesh, and he noticed there was a fly flying around. And is the right word. If it ends up in the soup, that's bad. But if he can't find it, then the whole soup is awesome. So he watches it, and Taka made a dive into the soup. So he quickly grabbed a ladle, or a spoon, whatever it is, and took out the fly with some of the soup. So what's the halacha about the soup? Perfectly kosher, even if it stayed a while. Because at worst scenario, what's in the soup? Only a tam of that tesheretz. Tam is batal b'shishim. It's a beria, but berry is also, the tam is batal b'shishim. But then he started scratching his head and thinking, wait a second, the soup is fine. Maybe I have to kasha the ladle or the spoon that I took it out with. Because he looked at it, and the fly was a nice size fly. But even if it's not a nice size fly, in a spoon, there's no shishim. So maybe I have to kasha the spoon. Just like he would never drink the soup in the ladle, because that is no shishim, so the pot's okay, but the ladle's not okay, the soup's not okay, so maybe the ladle or the spoon, whatever he took it out with, needs kashering, because you have a fly without shishim. So you say, oh, wait a second, you're not going to blow that by me. This is a kli rishon, right? And ladle's a kli sheini. But that's wrong. Why? Very pashut. Because this went into a kli rishon, and you're going back to our original yisoid, that something in a kli rishon we treat l'chumra like a kli rishon. And zok the issa v'heta, as one of the earliest achrayim in Chav Zayin Beis, this very shaila, when you had a fly in the soup and you quickly took it out, we have to assume that the ladle that went into the kli rishon, l'chumra, is a din of a kli rishon. So now you have a kli rishon, picture a pot with soup and a fly. That is absorbing tarfis into the ladle. If you could assume the ladle is a kli sheini, then it doesn't affect the ladle. But since the chumra ladle is a kli rishon, we have to assume that the ladle became affected by the fly. And this is Gepaskin, the Ramon Yerideh, Kuv Zayin Beis. And the Shach, Sivkot and Zayin is on a Machzikin Akaf, Aishaitik Ma'akdera Atzma. This ladle, when you took it out, l'chumra is a kli rishon. So it transfers the tam from the fly into the soup, which goes into the ladle. So the ladle, in fact, needs kashering. Good and talk to you all. Yes.
Shame making sure tell like you'll be a shikart or Smith today's shear. As I'm after Kaddish or Smith will say Sikum. And I live in a Kaddish him or Stagar is both of the Zakis. It's so big able to time it Shnema and Hofes and Zidkai Ladle Terriane.
Sheini.
Machlokes whether the Sikum is a rishon, sheini, but it's Davacham. Stand we up.
Okay, just the chaz we learned today, Bez Hashem, we see the status of a ladle is very not pashit, and the Paisim, Rishonim, and Gedolei Achronim assume that it's a suffix, and the Chumra we treat a ladle like on Shabbos, like had it been a kli rishon, and in Kashrus we treat it l'chumra like a kli sheini. The chiddush of the ladle is it's not a kli rishon because it's not on the fire. Maybe it's a kli sheini, but then again it goes in the kli rishon. So that's the suffix which we never really determined, but we treat it l'chumra on both ends. The side of a kli sheini has two milas, if you want to call it that. Number one, it's not a gabi eish, and the walls are originally cold. A ladle, the walls were cold, but maybe it was affected by being in the pot. The Mishnah does say this big chiddush, if you have two chumras, two reasons to be machmir, we could add the two up and make it into a heta. In other words, you have to be machmir with a ladle. But you have to be machmir with a ladle. How about you putting baked items, that is also chumra, that adds up to a heta. Basically, a cup of coffee, we're also machmir that we make it use a second cup, a kli shlishi, because we treat the coffee powder as a soluble, as a liquid, and yesh bishlach bishul by a davar lach. A cup that you shept water out of the urn is a real kli rishon. It's water gabi eish, so even though it's hotter water, but that's not for Shabbos. If you rinsed a bowl and the uncooked water is on the bowl, you can use a ladle to put onto that water, because that would be considered bishul of the droplets. If it's cooled water, a cooled soup that was once cooked, then you have the two coolers that coincide. To adding hot water to a cooled soup, or hot water, either one is good, into a cooled soup, you do have the heter if you use it by a ladle, because that would be the heter of double cooler. To keep a ladle in a pot at all times is good. This way you don't have a problem of reinserting the ladle, but then the ladle is vadai a kli rishon. If you put a ladle in and out and you're certain that it didn't heat up, then l'chayr it's back to its original status as a kli sheini. Adding baked items are okay if you have it through a ladle, or kolshkin if it's a kli shlishi. Deep fried is mutter without this issue because it's ein bishlach bishul. To dunk cake or cookies into hot coffee, make sure it's at least beyond the kli sheini, kli shlishi. Cold lukshen, if it's dry, can be put into the actual soup pot, shlei gabi eish, of course. If there's moisture, then you have to put it into a serving bowl, and then you could add the entire lukshen with the cold, uncooked water. Adding spices, I think the minig item is to add it to a kli sheini. Rabbi Zalman was concerned, maybe it's kali abishal. Expanding a soup, you could put the soup into a serving bowl and add water as much as you want into that. Ladling onto spices, I should mention, is a problem, because ladling from the kli rishon onto spices is like iri kli rishon. Ladling into a kli sheini, that would be like a kli shlishi l'kula if you have other tzad b'meikum. A hot cup as a ladle, you could be saimach, it's a kli sheini. A spatula does not affect anything at all. A dava gush we treat like a kli rishon, but if you have a different kula, ketchup or anything else, then you could say that it's two kulas, you're allowed to be saimach, add them up together. Kashering only with an iri kli rishon. A ladle could only be used if it's on the fire and it's kept in the fire, as we said. You ladled milchig soup, used a ladle soup, fleishig soup, of course, into a milchig bowl. The bowl needs hechsher. A milchig ladle into a fleishig pot certainly needs hechsher. You took out a sheretz, a bug, from a hot soup, even agabi or eish, but we have to assume, taka, that even if you took it out, the ladle is like a kli rishon, and that would affect the status of the ladle because of the sheretz. Yes, Rabbi.
You didn't forget.